Okay, so I decided to do the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake. Here is a picture of Thailand where some of the most impact was. So I decided to do a map showing the different locations, and the first location was the epicenter, which was right here, number one, and this happens December 6th of 2004. And the initial earthquake started at 6:59 a.m. and it is considered the third largest in the world since 1900, and it was scaled 9.1 on the Richter scale. The earthquake began 16 or 18.6 miles below the ocean floor, and this happened along a reverse fault in Sunday Trench, where the Indian plate subducted underneath the Burma plate, which we talked about in our earthquake lessons, and just the different types of movements of tectonic plates and what causes different earthquakes. So, the sequence of tsunamis, the highest recorded was 100 feet high total. And as you can see, I have the four main locations that the tsunami impacted, and the total casualties from this earthquake and tsunami included 227,898 people. So moving on to Banda Aceh, Indonesia, there was a total of $6 billion in damage. And as you can see here is the closest location to the earthquake. There was a lot of islands in here that was also impacted, but Aceh was the main location that had a lot of people with fatalities. The next location was Madam Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was hit one of the worst in the entire earthquake. The tsunami moved up over here towards Indonesia, but the waves continued over 100 miles, I believe, to Sri Lanka, and the earthquake hit mainly on the southeast coast, and it the southwest coast where Mata Peg was, or Madam Pegama was, it had the most deaths with 35,322 deaths, 21,441 injured, and over the entire Sri Lanka coast, it was 833 miles that was impacted. In total in Sri Lanka, there was 195 schools destroyed and 89,000 houses destroyed or damaged. And there was 23,449 acres of cultivable land destroyed by salinity. So all the salt water intruded on all of the soils where they had all of their crops, and it was no longer they were no longer able to grow crops on this land due to all of the salt. Another major area was Phuket, Thailand. There's about 5,000 deaths here, and the waves reached as far as 1.2 miles inland. The Indian coast was also impacted. In this chart right here, you can see the coast of India and the different towns that were impacted mainly. And this also shows the max amplitude along the east coast of India, and it correlates from the map to the side, which I really liked this graph because I thought it gave a good visual. So the Indian coast, the life and prosperity was lost within 100 meters of the shore. And there was also valleys in filled in water in the Pulicat Tarang Bade valleys. So a lot of the water reached the inland, and the geography of this coast considered like a lot of different uh elevations with topography, and since like the mud and soils that they have, lots of erosion happened in this area, and all the water created more mudslides which ended up filling these valleys. So this is the overall impact and just what really connected back to our course and what we've been learning. So this is just another image of Banda Aceh, Indonesia. This was actually taken on January 5th of 2005. So about 2 weeks after. So you can see here that a lot of the water still stayed in the area and it wasn't really flushed back out. And in total, there was $13 billion in damage, and this was considered 2017 dollars. So there was that does take into account the inflation. But so there was three main spheres of the world impacted. First was the geosphere, and there was land in these four countries mainly completely destroyed. There was changes in topography, so the water would rush the land, create different erosion. So areas that used to be high level came down a little bit, and the overall level elevation against sea level just changed because all the water that impacted it would bring all the soils in from the further into the land as it draw back out. And so the level of land was higher after the tsunami. And this was after all the water came back out and everything like that. The biggest part was also vegetation. Um, all of these countries have very different kinds of land and different geography and things like that. But a lot of these countries are also not as wealthy, so their people do rely mainly on all of the crops that they produce. And so this was completely devastating for them because families and people who lived off of their land by growing their food, it was completely wiped out and they could not grow things for years. The soil levels were just also completely changed, like the salinity, like I was saying before. So even years after that, the tsunami like ended and everything was cleared out, the different nutrients in the soils completely changed. So they also had to change their our agricultural habits. Next was the biosphere. And as you know from the beginning, the biosphere changed with like the ocean floor and when the tectonic plates slid underneath each other. Another portion of it happened within the ocean. There was uplift of coral reefs. So a lot of the ecosystems underneath the water and on the ocean floor in these areas were completely changed just with the big mass of water coming in. Additionally, the salinity in fresh water also was greatly impacted. So there was a lot of basins in these areas, and the runoff in the basins were now impacted by the fresh water, or sorry, the salt water. So a lot of people who use this water for their house and whatnot could no longer use it because of all the salt that impacted it. Lastly, the other sphere that was also impacted was it was the atmosphere, and this had lots of changes in humidity and changes in air pressure. So when all the water invaded the land from the tsunami, the air around there just got more humid because there was more water in the area, so evaporation was different. There was also changes in air pressure as well. The biggest thing that we've talked about mainly in this map is the human impact. As we were saying the statistics before, there was just tons of casualties and injured people and displaced people. This was also considered the third largest tsunami in the world, and it just took years to rebuild. And there was a lot of people angry with the government since they were not putting enough funding and helping their people, especially with all the income families that live in these areas. Another thing that people learned from this is how they should rebuild the foundations of buildings and towns and all their architecture just in case that another huge tsunami happens like this. So they were able to not necessarily they learned from it, but I feel like that is a bad way of putting it, just in the sense of like now they could advance their technology because they could see what didn't work in the past. And lastly, there were tons of feedback loops impacted in the tsunami and earthquake. Um, the main one is all of the pushes and pulls of the tidal waves. So, as we learned before in the course, how the waves are pushed and pulled by the tides of the moon or the gravity of the moon, and how like the different air pressures when it becomes daytime and nighttime, with the land and the water cycle, how the different pressures between the nighttime and the daytime like crisscross when it's on the land. So it was really hard for these areas to retrieve back to their normal ways. The stationary water completely impacted it, especially the water cycle, since there was all the water sitting there in that area. There was more evaporation due to the more water on the land, and so there was more rainfall, and it took a lot longer for obviously all the water to dry up because there was so much water in the area to evaporate and also get pulled back into the land. And I think these feedback loops, especially between like the air pressure of the water and also just the water cycle within the land itself and the water cycle in the ocean and these coastal towns kind of overlapped with each other. So there was tons of impact on one another. But these are the main parts that were impacted in this earthquake and tsunami. And we have all these different areas as well. So feel free to scroll through it and reference back to some of the statistics that I wrote on here. But I thought this form of the project would have been the best way to display this, having the pinpoints, just kind of showing a visual of where it was impacted and how within having the epicenter down here, it impacted all the way up here in India, how Sri Lanka was one of the most devastated countries, even though Indonesia was here as well. But that just shows how harsh a 9.1 earthquake on the Richter scale, even underneath the ocean floor, impacts countries which are hundreds of miles away.